Today on this episode of The Crossover, we will be discussing chronic traumatic encephalopathy, the truth behind the media, with CEO of the Concussion Foundation and former WWE superstar, Dr. Chris Nowinski. Learn how this professional athlete turned neuroscientist has trailblazed the current movement to recognize, prevent, and treat sports-related head injuries across the globe. Much more on this episode of The Crossover. Good afternoon, everyone. We have the pleasure of speaking with Chris Nowinski today, who's a pioneer in sports-related head injury. Currently, Chris is CEO of the Concussion Foundation. He's also a neuroscientist, author, and keynote speaker. As background, Chris was an all-Ivy League Harvard football player and WWE professional wrestling superstar who discovered the concussion crisis the hard way. In 2003, he had a kick to the chin in a WWE match, which ended his career, causing post-concussion syndrome. Since then, Chris has been on a mission to educate athletes, coaches, and medical professionals regarding sports-related head injuries. Chris has written the book, Head Games, Football's Concussion Crisis, and has served as co-director of the BU Center for the Study of Chronic Traumatic Encephalopathy. Chris's journey has been profiled on HBO, ESPN, and the New York Times. Chris earned his doctorate in behavioral neuroscience and has authored more than 30 scientific publications. Vice Sports called him the man most responsible for making CTE part of the national conversation, and Sports Illustrated said, "It is Nowinski's figure which looms behind sports' newfound commitment to minimizing head trauma." Sports Illustrated also named Chris a finalist for Sportsman of the Year. Here today to discuss CTE and the truth behind the media. Chris, very excited to talk to you about this. I've spoken to a lot of experts, but obviously you're kind of the forefront of this research and where we're going from here. So very excited to hear your opinion on this.
Yeah, no, happy to share it. Appreciate it.
So let's just start with basics. People who may not know exactly what CTE is. What is CTE for the layperson?
CTE is a neurodegenerative disease that's caused by repeated hits to the head and repeated traumatic brain injuries. And it starts as small lesions around blood vessels at the depths of the sulcus of the cortex, and then it continues to spread after trauma. The trauma stops and can cause problems with cognition, sleep, and we think some mental health issues.
What are the signs and symptoms that athletes or anyone who's had head injury should look out for?
Yeah, it's one of those things that what's causing CTE are things you aren't going to feel. And so one of the important things we just published another study in June that showed very clearly there's no correlation between diagnosed concussions and CTE, because diagnosed concussions are such a small part of your overall head trauma experience if you're a football player or contact sport athlete. So what you should look for, I mean, we really can't really predict this. What's best to predict people who have CT are long exposures to head trauma, and then a consistent decline in cognition is most predictive, late life. And then what we're learning is that a lot of these midlife issues that we hear about, a lot of the high-profile CT cases, some of them could be related to CT, some could be related to the concussion, some could be related to transition or other things. And so it's important that we consider it could be a cause of those things. But when we're talking about treating patients, we talk about you can treat out of those symptoms, especially in midlife.
Now, people might want to know what sports are the greatest risk. We all hear about football and the NFL's mission to kind of reduce CTE and reduce concussions, but what are some other sports where there's a high rate of CTE?
So we actually don't know a whole lot about rates of CTE because we don't have a way to diagnose living people, and so we're studying this through brain banks. This was originally seen in boxers, and I think everyone by the 1950s understood that boxing causes people to get punch drunk, and we're talking about the same disease. And there were a handful of other sports diagnosed prior to we started looking at NFL players in the early 2000s. Since then, we've basically found it in everything you would expect to. So American football, Canadian football, Australian rules football, rugby union, rugby league, ice hockey, soccer are sort of the big ones with the largest participation numbers, but we all see it in military veterans, even those who didn't play sports but were exposed to blast, repetitive trauma. We see it in people who didn't play sports but were exposed to had impacts through maybe a poorly treated epilepsy or developmental disorders that cause headbanging behavior. But the MMA is an obvious place. Professional wrestling, it's been seen. It's sort of everywhere you'd think we're finding it.
Now, I just want to clarify for all of our listeners. First, does every single blow to the head and every single concussion cause permanent damage of some sort? And secondly, can the brain recover if given enough rest?
So not every hit to the head causes brain damage, that's for sure. But some hits, and usually those with greater force, can. Not every concussion causes physical brain damage. The concussion is sort of known as two separate issues. One is what they call the neurometabolic cascade of concussion, which recovers. And the other is physical damage from concussion that you can pick up through different scans or identifying proteins in the bloodstream from physical brain injury and blood-brain barrier breakdown. So to answer that simply, some concussions are causing physical brain damage. Some non-concussive asymptomatic hits are causing physical brain damage. You don't heal dead neurons. You don't bring them back to life, but your brain does have plasticity and can adapt around them. And so most people with concussions will recover their cognitive function to a very, to where they were before or very close to it. And then with some people, too many brain injuries can cause some permanent deficits, but usually they're very subtle as well. And if you can get out of concussions without getting a degenerative brain disease, which, again, all those hits can add up, you should be okay long term, but you just might be a little different.
In terms of what is a bigger risk, multiple small hits or one major hit, right? So the example would be a lineman in the NFL who's not getting knocked unconscious, but he's every single play, multiple small head, concussions, head injuries versus one kind of lights out concussion. Do we know which one's worse?
It depends on what outcome we're thinking about, right? So the lights out concussion is going to cause more acute problems and, more physical brain damage that again, you can work around, but will always be there. The smaller hits, hopefully not, but if you get too many in a row, it's hard for us to piece together through looking at brains post-mortem and not knowing everyone's exact sports history. What are the greatest risk factors? We do think, that a 40G hit is not twice as bad as a 20G hit. It's probably, 5 times as bad, and then the 80G hit might be 20 times as bad. The higher you go, the probably more important those hits are. And most of the hard hits you take will not cause concussion. Like for every one, there's one study that we just put into a publication for submission. For every concussion a football player gets in college, they probably get more than 300 hits that were harder than that concussion, but they didn't cause symptoms. Those are probably what we should be looking at when we're thinking about CT risk, is how many really hard hits are you taking? And how close are they together? So there's just something like football is very good at creating CT over time. And it probably has a lot to do with, the brain's not made to take 50 hard hits a week, with some of those being really hard hits.
Yeah, it seems like it's that repetitive, second hit syndrome a lot of times, where how much time is enough rest, and we don't really know what that is. But I'm sure the brain, as it's recovering, is just simply more vulnerable. You had mentioned it earlier that we are limited in our ways of diagnosing it. Are we essentially limited to just post-mortem studies, or is there any other current method to diagnose CTE?
Yeah, we have to put this in context with other similar diseases, and Alzheimer's would be a good example, where when you go to a doctor and they say your grandmother has Alzheimer's, they're not sure until they study her brain post-mortem if the reason her memory is failing is due to Alzheimer's or due to a similar disease. And the reason why doctors feel comfortable diagnosing Alzheimer's is they've followed people for decades, saw them clinically, did tests, and then figured out who had Alzheimer's actually when they died. And they came up with a criteria that gives them 80% sensitivity specificity. and that makes them comfortable. We don't have that with CT. We haven't been studying it long enough. We've been ignoring it. So it's one of those things that, like, our team seeing now, thousands of cases, or sorry, nearly 1,000 cases, and people in clinic, they feel they're getting better at predicting who has it. But it's still not in a place where we can roll out a criteria and tell people, if you have A, B, and C, but not, D, C, and E, or D, E, and F, that we know how often that will be correct. And so some clinicians will tell people they have likely CTE. Other ones aren't comfortable making that diagnosis yet, but they're using PET scans, they're using MRIs, they're using neuropsychological tests. No one's really using blood biomarkers yet, but we will be. And people are trying to piece together what's going on.
Now, speaking of biomarkers, what about FDDNP? Is that something that holds promise?
No. That's something that fought for some headlines almost 10 years ago, and then the FTC sent them a letter saying, please stop saying you're diagnosing CT. And it's not one of the top candidates out there.
Got you. And let's say someone gets diagnosed with CTE. Is there any treatment?
Right now, all treatment's symptomatic. So if you think you have CT, like, there are definitely treatments that can help you with cognition, help you with sleep, help you with mental health issues, anxiety, depression, impulsivity, things that can be related to CT, we think. But right now, we don't know how to stop the disease. I mean, it's been exciting to watch the Alzheimer's industry over the last few months develop disease-modifying drugs. They're just targeted at something different than what CT is. And so there is hope that we'll have a disease that can slow down the degeneration of the brain. But we need more scientists working on it right now.
How close do you think we are to having good biomarkers?
It all depends on if the current studies work out. So we just, we just finished recruiting for another PET scan. We're rolling out 2 more PET scan studies soon to figure out what's going to bind best to what we think is the tau and CTE. We are going to be launching a blood biomarker study soon that hopefully within 5 years can give us a profile of what CT looks like. But so it really depends on if the bets we're making now work out. We have something in 5 to 10 years we're confident with. If they don't, we'll have to keep trying.
This episode is brought to you by Vitamin Water. Vitamin Water contains the optimal blend of electrolytes to fuel your day. So whether it's doing brain surgery or simply relaxing at the beach, Vitamin Water should be your source of hydration. Check out vitaminwater.com for more information and use promo code CROSSOVER for 20% off your first order. That's CROSSOVER for 20% off. Now, the next question is a little bit controversial because I want to know how involved and invested you feel that the NFL is in CTE research. I've had multiple discussions with Dr. Omalu about this. And, in your opinion, how invested is the NFL? Are they legitimately and genuinely interested in protecting the players and preventing this disease and hopefully treating it?
Well, there's very separate questions. So I think, there's been a move to reduce exposure for players in the NFL. That's primarily been led by the Players Association, which I'm an advisor to, who, back in the collective bargaining agreements, 2010, 2011, successfully negotiated for ceasing hitting in practice for the most part. And that's been probably the biggest thing. That's what we told them was the biggest thing they could do to prevent CTE. So when you see them now, continuing to mess with kickoffs and the rules and all that, I think there is a movement to reduce overall brain trauma. I don't think it's necessarily in the NFL's best interest to have all their heroes die of CT going forward, but the NFL is still recruiting kids to the game, so I don't think their heart's, fully in CT prevention. With that being said, on the treatment side, no, the NFL is investing more money in helmets and investing more money in concussion stuff and investing very little in CTE, and has been, sort of famously tried to block Boston University getting money for CT research because it wasn't their guys who didn't have the same strength of opinion around this, how important CT is. So, it's one of those things that it could be much, much more, but there's market forces at play.
Yeah, I mean, you said it best. Whether you like it or not, it is one of the largest businesses in the country. And so at the end of the day, money is driving a lot of those decisions. And how ethical that is an entirely different podcast. So, speaking about educating people and the NFL kind of raising awareness, do you think that we've done a good enough job educating the public? Do you think that the average American knows what CTE is?
The average American knows the letters CT are important and that it's a bad disease. Like that, the polling has showed that very clearly. We went from no one knowing what CT was 20 years ago to now over 90% of people think it's a serious public health problem. So that's good. Not everybody understands the nuances of CT, so there's still a lingering connection in the public and even among athletes that concussions is what's driving CT. And so we're working hard to undo that. It was a reasonable hypothesis perhaps 20 years ago, but now the evidence is very clear that concussions are sort of a distraction from understanding how we prevent CTE. I think we're all learning what the symptoms are in real time, right? Like in the early days, like a lot of the cases were suicide cases and people's lives falling apart. And we're trying to understand what about those stories is it CT driving that? Is it the brain injuries they got to get CTE driving that? There are other things going on? NFL players have chronic pain issues. They have, other health issues. So I think, we're doing a pretty good job, and especially considering that there's no one trying to help. So all the education is primarily happening through the media, and that's been a conscious choice of ours because the NFL hasn't created a CT education program for players. U.S. Soccer hasn't created a CT education program for soccer players. The National Hockey League still denies that their game causes it, and so there isn't a go-to source, and no one's required to actually learn about the state of the science on CTE. So all things considering, that people are learning through the media. And movies and documentaries, we're doing pretty well.
What about age? I think a lot of people wonder, are younger developing brains more at risk or older, less plastic brains? Who's more at risk for CTE if they get a head injury?
Well, I think we'd have to sort of restructure the question. Like, we're not going to find that connection in the literature or the data on if you get one brain injury as a young person, old person, what's your odds of CT? Because in the absence of other hits to the head, there are no known cases of people getting CT from that. And then the other part of that question that's difficult is there are very few adults who take thousands of hits to the head. So we don't have a population really of people who started getting hit in the head in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 10,000 times. It's mostly kids. And that's one of the messed up things about this disease is that the people at risk for this disease, 95% children in this country. We don't ask adults when they play recreational soccer, don't head balls usually. There's no pickup tackle football on the weekends among us old guys. None of that exists. So all we know is that the young brain is very vulnerable to CTE for sure. We have a publication coming up looking at over 100 athletes who died before 30 and their CT status and severity. So if you start, there's probably a lag between when you start getting hit in the head, when you get the disease, and when you get the diagnostic lesion of CT. So the youngest CT case has been published at 17. There was just a press conference where a doctor offhandedly remarked that they have a 15-year-old CT case. So I don't know how young you'd have to be to maybe we'll end up seeing lesions in 10 and 11-year-olds someday, but very few of those kids die and very few of those brains are donated. So we may never get that window as to how early it can happen. But I think it's more of a social commentary of we'll never have a database of people who started getting in their 50s because people are too smart by then to let that happen to them.
Interesting. And what about genetic risk factors? Is there anything that would predispose to the development of CTE?
No. Right now, it's still early days in genetics, but we've published multiple studies out of Boston University where there are none of the common first look genetics that we know from Alzheimer's and other neurodegenerative diseases are showing up to alter risk of CT. They do appear to alter severity of CT, how fast it progresses and where it progresses to. But there's no genetic profile that's protective from getting the disease. And I think that becomes most clear when we look at our NFL population. We've studied almost 400 NFL players, and 93% of them had the disease. So there's probably no magic gene that's going to keep this from happening to your brain if you get hit in the head enough.
Now, let's just say you were the commissioner of the NFL. You are Roger Goodell. What would you do differently?
So the only way that you're not going to have your future best NFL players, like your Hall of Famers, almost all get CTE, is if you both change what happens to in the NFL, but change what happens to them before they come to the NFL. And what the NFL is not doing is using their influence to make the game safer throughout a football player's life cycle. And that's a tremendous missed opportunity. And the problem is there's no incentives in college sports to make football safer. And so the reforms that have happened at the NFL level, so for example, 80% of concussions at the NFL are happening in games. And that probably also means 80% of the hard hits are happening in games. It's the reverse in college football. 70% of concussions are happening in practice.
Wow.
And that's at the schools that are willing to be studied with sensors on their players and scientists on the sideline every day. So you kind of imagine the ones that aren't being watched, how bad it might be. And then with everything happening, coming out of Northwestern, you just start to wonder, where are people's hearts on this thing? So, if the NFL wants to see CT go away, it's actually quite easy, right? I would say there's the risk benefit for small children on football and CT is there's very little benefit to playing young. There's huge risk. And so I would say if you went no tackle football, just flag till high school, and then you really fought to reform how we play and practice in high school and college, and the changes are made at the NFL level be applied there, you'd probably eradicate, according to some of the data we have, 80, 90% of future CT cases. But right now, hearts aren't in it for that. And so we're still going to keep diagnosing people with CT for a long time.
Super interesting how most of it happens in practice, the fact that colleges don't have their hearts into it. So what you're advocating for is no real contact sports before 14 or 15. And then in high school and college, have reforms like the NFL where no hitting in practice or limited hitting. And that in and of itself should really reduce the number of CTE. That seems pretty reasonable.
We just based on the study published in June, using sensor data from modern studies laid over our 600 football players who we've studied, we found that number and strength of hits is predictive of CT extraordinarily well. But the math also suggests if you cut half of a lineman's hits in practice throughout high school and college, that you could reduce CT by 50% just from that act alone, not even touching the game. So it is the door is open there to preventing it, but the will is not there.
Wow, that is very inspirational. I think we just need to continue to kind of raise awareness. Another very interesting question is, in your opinion, how prevalent is CTE in the NFL? So when I asked this question to Dr. Amalu, his response was 100% of the players in the NFL have some form of CTE, whether it's clinically significant or only on pathology. They all have it due to their careers, what they've had in high school, in college, and the NFL. Do you agree with that statement that all NFL players to some extent will have CTE?
No, simply because we have that small 7% that don't have it in our sample. And again, we know our sample is not representative, but then it's debatable how representative it is. So I think it'd be a shock. I'd be shocked if it wasn't more than half. And it could be as high as, I think, 70, 80%. But we'll have a better window into that with some future studies coming up.
Another controversial question. Based on your experience having concussion, and then now through all of your research and all of your advocacy, should we ban contact sports in general? Boxing, MMA, hockey, football, all of these sports that we love in America, but clearly have such a high risk. Should those be banned?
No. Having gone into professional wrestling, it sort of changed my window into what professional sports are in this country. And the way I look at it now, and the way the system is set up, all professional sports are entertainment first, right? It's just can we sell tickets and get eyeballs and make money? And so from that perspective, it would be difficult to ban dangerous forms of entertainment that adults are doing with informed consent and risks managed. Because if you ban the sports, you have to ban Cirque du Soleil, you have to ban all sorts of, it's sort of a never-ending string. So I believe, as someone who used to do a very dangerous job, adults can do a dangerous job if they have informed consent, and also measures are taken to protect them when they're not being exploited. That's a separate conversation about, do they have informed consent today, which I don't think they do. Every time I meet another active NFL player, they don't understand CTE. They don't think they're at risk. And then our measures being taken in the sports where they do have active unions and player associations, yes, in some cases, but in other cases, no. If you think about the other unions, they're not even talking about this issue to protect the athletes. So we don't have to ban adults doing these things. We do have to do them much better. And then with kids, I mean, I do agree that we shouldn't be exposing anybody before 14 to getting CTE. We have a campaign at the Concussion Legacy Foundation called Stop Hitting Kids in the Head, trying to be very explicit about, like, why the hell would we do this to children when we know there are both concussions and CTE down the road, and the benefits for them at that age are minimal, and they have no idea what they're getting into. So I think a blanket ban of bashing kids in the head on purpose is a good idea, and I hope we can get there.
No, seems very reasonable. Another controversial question: would you let your kids play football just like you did? You were all Ivy League at Harvard. You obviously played in high school. I don't know when you started, but let's say your kids were like, Dad, I love football. I want to start playing Pop Warner. I'm into it. What's your response?
I mean, there's zero chance they'd play before high school. And I'm on the fence on whether they play in high school, because the problem with my kids is with my genes, if they play in high school, they'll probably be good enough to play in college. And a high school and college career will put them at significant risk for CT. And I don't know if we'll get the reforms in place, but even with the reforms, it'll be a non-zero risk. And I'm already watching friends die. We just diagnosed my former roommate who drank himself to death with stage 2 CTE. He was a Harvard captain and was a great guy, and then just wasn't. And so, and I think those things are related. So, I mean, I would have to see a hell of a lot of effort from the football community and acceptance of this. I would need to see coaches taking responsibility for this, and that's what I'm not seeing right now. I literally can count the number of coaches on my hand who believe that the choices they make in practice are determine who gets CT or not. And the reality is that is the case. And so until there's acceptance of CT as a consequence of football within the community, and coaches who have preached character to me since I was a little kid take responsibility for what they owe to these kids, I wouldn't give my kid to them.
Yeah, listen, Chris, what an amazing interview. I just, 3 take-home points. Number one, kudos for all of your advocacy, everything you've done as a former professional athlete, having experienced this, pushing ahead, raising awareness, pushing ahead the research. Just, I could not be more impressed with what you've done, and you should be very proud. Number two, is the unfortunate, NFL's priorities. Where are they? Right. And obviously it's a business. At the end of the day, money talks, unfortunately, and that has to be taken into account. I would only hope that they would put their players first, but at the end of the day, we don't know, because when you're running a multi-billion-dollar industry, things get clouded. So I think that's point number two. And I think 3, everything you said about making all of these sports safer, not just football, but hockey and soccer, not hitting kids in the head, waiting till they're at least in high school, if not college, limiting the contact in practice. These are game changers. And I can only hope that leadership listens to you and that they make these contact sports safer. I played football also back in high school, and I can tell you, just like you, I think there's major benefits to playing football, but at the same time, there's major risk. And so I think the question of, do the risks outweigh the benefits, is very controversial, but I definitely agree with you. I would say no, especially if the person's playing college as well as high school.
Yeah, it's one of those things like some are the risks worth it is it comes down to are you one of the lucky ones who don't get CTE,
Yeah.
right? Because well, some guys won't, and therefore, and if they don't get chronic injuries, it was worth it. But we don't know who those people are. And again, we're not trying to protect them. And I think that's the problem.
Yeah, it's such an exciting time with all the research that you're pushing ahead. I suspect there's going to be major breakthroughs in the not so distant future for kind of detection, seeing who's at risk. Like you said, that would be huge. Knowing that if you have a predisposition, just like we can kind of tell who can get Alzheimer's and who is more predisposed, or at least there's early studies on that, then those people we would know from an early age you cannot play contact sports. So
I push
hopefully,
back on that though. So this conversation comes up a lot, and I've talked about this with genetics folks and ethicists. The problem is, if this was true, if you got the exposure as an adult, this would be an informed choice. But if we're talking about, if we know that the genes are not fully, there's no genetic profile that's fully protective against CT, putting that on a child to say, well, you have bad genes, so you shouldn't play, but you have okay or better genes, you still could get CT, so we're going to let you get whacked in the head. That doesn't fly by the ethicists. So I don't think we have that opportunity for kids. And everyone starts as a kid. No one starts getting hit in the head as an adult.
yeah, I mean, basically, it should start. I mean, Benedict Amalu said that there should be no football before the age of 18 or 21, just like drinking. You can't drink until you're an adult because you make that decision. And the concept of you can't play football until you're an adult, and someone sits down with you and says, "Look, it's your decision. You're an adult. These are the risks. You understand it. Are you willing to go ahead with it?" That's another interesting concept, is to wait till people are adults, but again, college football, multi-billion-dollar industry. That's not going anywhere.
Right. I mean, it might be a clean, ethical way to look at it, but it's not very practical considering with,
Of course.
yeah, it just isn't going to happen anytime soon. That's why we're focused on getting people to 10 or 14. Like, can we even agree on that?
Yeah.
Um, and we can't discuss 18 or 21 until we get to that.
Listen, Chris, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Have a great weekend.
Hey, thanks. You too. Really pleasure.
All right. Take care, bud.
All right, you too.